Greetings, humans.
Welcome to another episode of Humans of the Multiverse, where we share the stories of our friends from all over the globe.
We hope you find this conversation interesting and uplifting. Our goal is to bring people together, so if you enjoy the interview, we'd love to hear your comments.
Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thanks for watching. Laird Scranton is the author of a series of books and other writings on ancient cosmology and language. These include articles published in Anthropology News Academic Journal, the Encyclopedia of African Religion, and even the Encyclopedia Britannica. He is featured in John Anthony West's Magical Egypt documentary series and in Carmen Boulter's documentary series, The Pyramid Code, both groundbreaking works that have sparked the curiosity of millions and led to a revolution in our understanding of the human story. Laird is also a frequent guest on a wide range of radio and podcast interview shows, including Red Ice Radio in Europe, Art Bell's Coast to Coast Radio, and Gaia TV's Beyond Belief with George Noory. You can regularly find him as a presenter at conferences such as the Conference on Precession and Ancient Knowledge, or CPAC. We hope you enjoy what we found to be a fascinating and illuminating presentation on the wisdom of humanity's ancient past. That's how I got familiar with you and the crew back then, you, John Anthony West, Robert Schock, and all those guys.
Right.
And so this is just a huge privilege for me. So thanks for joining the show.
Oh, I'm happy to do it. You know, I'm always glad to meet the interesting people in the community that we're in. You know, everybody brings their own perspectives and their own little pieces of knowledge to it.
For sure. And, you know, having an open mind is important. Mike and I what we're trying to do here is create a little platform for people. We're not researchers ourselves, but we're just interested in these topics. So we're trying to create a platform for, you know, people like you in the new generation. And it's been just a blast since we got started. So,
well, you got to be careful. It reaches out and grabs you. You know, I sort of wrote my first book against my will. I was keeping notes about what I was learning, you know, same as you guys. Mm-hmm. And I realized after a while I had enough information to publish an article or publish a book.
Could you kind of talk to us about that a little bit? Like how you got started? Tell us that story.
Sure. My wife had read a book called Unexplained by Jerome Clark, where every chapter in the book talks about some mystery in the world that they haven't solved. And one of the chapters is about this little African tribe called the Dogon, who are primitive, but seem to know things about astronomy that they shouldn't know without technology. And so I thought, wow, wherever that goes is going to be interesting. I'm going to look into it.
Yeah.
Here I am a couple of decades later.
What year was that?
That was the late 1990s. I ended up publishing my first book in, I think, 2003.
Okay.
Around that time, you weren't trying to become an author before that? This was something you were interested in your spare time? How did that grow and evolve into writing the full-blown book?
I had majored in English in college. I had a good, strong background in English, so I had the skills I needed to be able to sit down and write an article or write a book. I've always had a passing interest in topics like these, but had never gotten sort of sucked into, you know, one little niche focus of it. But the Dogon are an excellent place to start that kind of thing, because their society is a kind of an umbrella over a number of ancient traditions. So if I had planned to do a comparative study, I could hardly have picked better than to start with the Dogon.
Yeah, so much rich material and so many connections to make that you're still making today.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a very, very deep hole. It sort of flips on itself. It starts out once you, a couple of the traditions tell you flat out that they're talking about science. But, you know, the skeptical modern mind says, yeah, sure, you're talking about science. But bit by bit, I started to see, you know, based on what I had, my education coming through school about, you know, very basic science, I could see they knew what they were talking about when they're talking about atoms and electrons and things like that. And so I was starting to compare what they said against what popularizers of science like Stephen Hawking and Brian Greene had to say. And then as time went on, that became a more and more challenging task. I finally had to move into the arena of 1920s era physicists to be able to confirm the likelihood of what the Dogon were saying as being correct science. And now it's flipped around on me again on that. Now it's at the point where I'm being led by what the ancient traditions are telling me, and I'm having to dig around through the 1920s and 30s science to come up with confirmation for, and some of the modern science as for confirmation for what they're saying.
Interesting.
A lot of those 20s and 30s physicists like Erwin Schrödinger were pretty well versed in the mystic Buddhism and Hinduism type of stuff.
Yeah, they were. And some of them were dedicated to trying to explain it all to a layperson like us.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's what we really need. Einstein said, if you can't explain a topic to a 6-year-old, as if you were explaining to a 6-year-old, you don't really understand it.
Yep.
So these are the guys who took the time to do that. They said, okay, we're not going to write a book that's all formulas, mathematical formulas. We're going to explain in plain English what happened next and why this theory knocked that theory out of the water and why this was preferred over that outlook and so forth. And you really have to, even among them, there's differences of opinion. So you have to really compare what they're saying, the same way I've been comparing ancient traditions to figure things out.
Which is okay. A good scientist will admit that science is not necessarily like a unified front. It should be a community of people striving to get the answers, and they won't always agree 100%.
Yeah, I was very fortunate to have a very strong educational background in elementary school in science. And the first thing they taught us was the concept of sincerely entertaining a perspective. And what that means is if you're researching a problem that there might be 5 answers to, the job of the researcher is to take each one of those possible answers and work it. Start with the presumptions of that perspective, the things they postulate, and then just follow where those lead. Yep. And eventually you realize that one of the solutions, under the perspective of one of the solutions, that a lot of the major obstacles just evaporate, and that's the one you want to follow.
Did you have other teachers at an early age in your elementary or middle school years that encouraged you to ask questions like that and ask the deep questions and the hard questions?
Yes. That I consider those years an invaluable. The little town I grew up in, Salem, Oregon, is the capital of Oregon, and their solution to the problem of what to do with the student who might be bored in their regular class was to pull 10 4th graders, 5th graders, and 6th graders out of class for an hour and a half every day and provide them with a teacher who was qualified to teach them whatever they wanted to learn. And we as a group would choose the next subject we wanted to learn. We learned about microscopy and chemistry and marine biology and geology and psychology and you name it, with a guy who was a cross between, Klaatu, Michael Rene, in Day the Earth Stood Still, and Charlton Heston, just a stunning guy who really knew his subject and knew how to explain it in layman's terms to a bunch of kids.
I like that comparison. I was able to picture that guy in my head based off of that description. That's pretty cool. I wanted to really ask you to go back a little bit, and as you're getting into this stuff, how did you end up meeting John Anthony West, and if you would share a fond memory of him with us, because he's a real inspiration to me as well.
Oh, sure, yeah. Well, I ended up self-publishing my first book starting in that period of time. It started becoming affordable to self-publish a book. Now you can self-publish a book for free. Back in those days, it was a few $100s to publish it. So I self-published the book, and it was available, through Amazon and outlets like that around the world. And I was sending out targeted emails to people in groups I thought might have an interest. And John later told me that he was in Egypt and he received that email, and he was really interested in the subject matter and wanted to read the book. The problem was that I had only told him where he could buy it. And he was the kind of guy who had authors lined up down the block and around the corner ready to hand him free books. He said he'd be damned if he'd buy the book. So one night we were sitting in our family room watching television, and the phone rings and the caller ID says, West, John. My wife picks up the phone and realizes who she has on the other end. And he and I talked for about 45 minutes until finally I offered to send him a book. turns out he only lived about 45 minutes south of where we live. So
Wow.
he then invited me to come down and meet him. And he conveniently left out a significant part of the meeting, that he had engaged the Magical Egypt videographers to film the meeting. And so that meeting, first time I've really had to explain this very complicated system of symbols to the guy who ought to know about it. I was being filmed as I was doing it. My wife was just off camera. You can't see her, but that became episode 8 of the first Magical Egypt series.
Wow. Yeah. And I watched Magical Egypt after Pyramid Code by the suggestion of Joe Rogan, because he's always talking about it. But so it's just been like this whole, I've been kind of following you around for 20 plus years. Yeah.
That somewhat captures the spirit of our show. Me and Dave basically said, well, let's flip the camera on and figure out the rest as we go.
That's great.
Great. Yeah. I saw, and with stuff like this often gets like labeled as alternative history and whatnot. And I saw you explain something on another podcast. I was hoping you'd explain on us a phrase you said, teaching humans is like tugging wild grass, and that comes from the Dogon. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
The word Dogon itself means wild grass, and their outlook is that trying to impart knowledge to a person is like tugging on wild grass. Wild grass tugs back. It's not an easy task to try to teach something to somebody. Mm-hmm. And so the Dogon adopt a one-on-one dynamic for instruction. This follows sort of the pattern of
apostles and
apprenticeship in over the years, how master skills of craftsmanship were passed down from a master to a student one at a time. And it was a superb way of passing those skills along. My friend Ed Nightingale is a master wood carver. He's restored artifacts for the Vatican and for other places.
Wow.
And he used to listen to podcasts and books on tape and so forth about esoteric topics as he was learning how to do that work.
Yeah, that's so I really thought that was interesting when I heard that phrase, because it really resonated with me as far as like even just people we interact with online and stuff in relation to these topics. Everyone's got an opinion. Everyone, is jostling for position. So I want to stay with John Anthony West for a second. Could you tell us about like visiting Egypt with John Anthony West and looking at vases and stuff like that? That just blows my mind.
Yeah, actually, I never went to Egypt with him. He always wanted me to. I always said I would travel to a place that I had a compelling reason to go to, and I ended up going to Orkney Island, north of Scotland, a couple of times, and to the Faroe Islands and places like that, but I've never been to Egypt. I did visit museums with John, and John was the guy you wanted to go with because he knew everything about everything, and he was used to explaining it because he did it all the time in his tours. The artifacts that he was most interested in that we were looking at were the very early stone vases that are carved out of intensely hard stone. No one can figure out how they managed to hollow out the inside of the vase, right, because these were carved from one block of stone. And he was fascinated. He said this is the best proof he knows of, among the best proof he knew of high technology in existence in ancient times, during the times of ancient Egypt.
Yep.
Yeah, and I would think that a lot of people still think those vases are the best example, just because they've been tested by, so many. They've been measured and tested in like modern like settings, and still nobody has a good explanation how they were done.
Right. I mean, we also have what looked like machine carved holes in granite that are pretty good examples of technology. There are some other circumstances where you have artifacts. I don't know if you're familiar with Michael Cremo's book, Forbidden Archaeology. It's a 700-page book that's just literally filled. It's rife with examples of out-of-place artifacts that have been discovered in various archaeological settings.
700 pages of like out of place artifacts. That is wild. I am familiar with the book. I haven't read it, but he's supposed to be coming on the show at some point too. So we're excited about that. But
he and I shared one of the CPAC venues along with some other presenters, and I joked about Walter Crittenden, who organized the conference, not being able to come up with enough pale white bald guys to.
So with 700 pages worth of out of place artifacts, plus like with the work that you do and stuff like that, just why do you think that there's still such a divide between like academia and these ideas?
Well, that divide is an interesting thing. When I started out, there was sort of a trend among alternative researchers to actively seek approval of the academic researchers.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, that's sort of a fool's mission, a fool's errand, that the community of alternative researchers, from my point of view, are making positive headway on their own, that there's no reason to be seeking outside approval. It's more likely that we're going to end up getting some of those academic researchers on board with some of the stuff we're doing. For some of the books I've written, I've actually had top researchers feeding me answers sort of under the table. I wrote a book about Immanuel Velikovsky, who you may or not know who he was. He was a colleague of Einstein's who wrote a very controversial book in 1950 called Worlds in Collision. And he proposed that Venus was a recent addition to the family of planets, only a few thousand years old, not billions of years old. Well, the researchers, the astronomers who study the exosolar systems have now come around to a consensus point of view about how those planets form that is almost indistinguishable from what Velikovsky says, that Velikovsky says Venus was the product of a collision between planets. So I've been fortunate. I was one of the male co-eds at Vassar College early on, and the Vassar community of graduates, of alumni, is a very open and approachable community. So when you need help for something, you can almost always find somebody from that community who can help you out. I was looking with my first book, I was trying to find an astronomer, a modern day astronomer who was well-versed in African star lore. And so I contacted a woman named Vera Rubin, who was another Vassar alum, who's one of the instrumental people in discovering dark matter. Huh. And she hooked me up with the right guy from South Africa. I also became friendly through one of the CPAC conferences with Jeff Marcy, who had run Berkeley's Search for Earth-like Planets for a long time. And I helped interview him at the CPAC conference. And he also was confirming a lot of information. I would ask him specific questions about how things work with astronomy, and he'd come back to me with an answer that was clear.
Right. So you're getting like basically under the table help from academics so you can put these pieces together. So I was just on my walk. I take an afternoon walk every day, and I was thinking, because we have this guy that we're interviewing tonight, actually, he's an academic who's like he's very staunch, and he's kind of in this argumentative phase on our X profile right now with one of the other people we've interviewed recently. It just basically shutting down alternative research. And I was just thinking to myself, like, the ticket is like, if we could all, the academics could work hand in hand with the alternative researchers. But I really like what you just said, which was, if I could paraphrase, they're actually learning from the academics are learning from alternative researchers, not vice versa.
Well, they potentially are. I'm in contact with researchers who are associated with Nassim Haramein. And one of these ladies has perspectives. There's a concept in the ancient symbology, it sort of leads you to it. The concept of what I call energetic dimensionality. We're all familiar with linear dimensionality, a line and an area and a volume. That begins, according to Einstein, with a fourth dimension, which is time. But time is not a linear dimension. It's an example, from my point of view, of an energetic dimension. So from the point of view of traditional academics, a geometric point has no dimensionality. But if you're allowing the concept of energetic dimensionality, a geometric point has the attribute of duration. And the ancient perspective is you have 3 descending energetic dimensions that interface at that geometric point with the linear dimensionality, which is material dimensionality. And so one of the astronomers who works for Nassim Haramein and I have been in contact about that. That's one of the areas that she actually writes about from a scientific perspective. And more and more often, I'm finding that scientific researchers are getting into a lot of the same material. One of the last book I wrote was called The Waters of Life, and it rests on biological research that was done by a late biologist named Mei-Wan Ho, and a researcher out of the University of Washington, Gerald, let's see, lost his last name off the top of my head. They're studying how the energetics of biology work in ways that people don't fully understand. And a lot of those dynamics play out in terms of ancient mythology. All of the ancient myths are trying to describe dynamics of energy to us. Well, first, I should probably back up and say there is really only one subject that's being addressed by the ancient symbolic mythology, or cosmology, and that's the question of how magnetism and electricity come together to create material forms. And virtually every word and every symbol and every creation myth, ultimately, if you get to the bottom of what the myth is about, is focused on that idea. How do these two energies work together? What are the dynamics of them? The system sort of starts, the first historical presentation we have of it is called Samkhya in India. Samkhya is a cosmological philosophy. It's a companion to yoga. Yoga is sort of the personalized version of Samkhya. And the first person to write down the Samkhya philosophy led with the idea, look, this is objective science, that whether you believe it or not, what we're talking about here is objective science. And then Samkhya talks in very generalized ways about these two energies and what their attributes are, and sort of establishes for us some of the symbolic representations that go with those attributes. Magnetism is classed as feminine energy, and electricity is classed as masculine energy. This is the concept of opposites. One of my books is called Primal Wisdom of the Ancients, and the focus of the book is on all the different techniques that you can point to that are being used in this system that I consider to be the hallmarks of some of the best teachers I've had. One example is, if you want to very quickly and efficiently communicate an idea to somebody, a new idea to somebody, one easy way to do that is with the use of a metaphor, to compare this thing they don't understand to something they full well understand. So I don't understand B, but I do understand A. If I can say to you, B is almost exactly like A, you're already in the mindset and in the ballpark of what B is about.
Right.
So they're using it all the time. Another version of that is the definition of opposites. If you know what cold is, and I try to explain hot to you, saying it's the opposite of cold puts you sort of in the mindset of where we're going.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Qualitative comparison can lead you to the fact that there are dipoles, if you can tell what's going on before you can exactly measure it even.
That's right. And people like Einstein, all of Einstein's insights derive from qualitative insights. He played little mind games with himself, mind exercises, imagining now what would happen if I were tossing a ball up and down while I was riding on a train. What would that tell me about how the energetics work? And so the Dogon take the same approach. Theirs is almost entirely a qualitative approach, not quantitative. They managed to lead us from the domain of, talking about materializing energy, they lead us from a domain of pure energy to one of materialized forms, never using a geometric sign that is more complicated than a circle, a square, or a triangle. and never using a mathematical value that's more complicated than 3.2 as an approximation of pi.
Interesting.
So I observe all of these commentary people have about very complex sacred geometry, and I realize that all of that is really overkill. You don't need it to explain what's going on.
Right.
That the right approach here is to reduce fractions. I know people complain about reductionism as being a flawed way of understanding things, but consciousness itself is an oscillation between seeing things in overview and seeing things in detail. The ability to reconcile an overview perspective with a detailed perspective defines consciousness for me. I think that if the possibility of an AI rests with its ability to do that, to take something it hasn't seen before, observe it in overview, and then break it down into its components and figure out what's going on with it.
That's fascinating, and I wanted to definitely get back to Dogon, but since you brought it up, have you messed around with any of the current AI systems that are going around and what they can do?
I have a little bit. I actually like Google's AI because when you submit, say 3 search terms together to it, it'll come back and explain to you. It'll troubleshoot the terms. It'll say there is a perspective from which these go together, and it's blah 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 blah, but that in general, we don't think of this as going well with that. And it's just troubleshooting your questions for you. And that's very helpful to me because it's something that if social media would do it when we make a post, we'd be a lot better off.
Yeah, because you'd see all the angles to the post, right?
Right. And because it makes you aware of the fact that perspectives that you think go together might not.
Right. I think the AI, what it does right now is it mimics that combination between the overview perspective and the detail perspective, right? But I don't know that it's actually manifesting
I think people are still better at that, and that is the hallmark of you have to see the big picture first to understand where to apply the attention to detail to solve a problem. But one can't exist without the other. So that'll be the hallmark if AI can do that.
That's right. It is. I have a friend who is a physicist. He's at the first CPAC conference I was at, John Anthony West. One of the things he did for me was he sort of introduced me to conferences all around the country and introduced me to the presenters and got me sort of backstage passes to hang out with the presenters and things like that. At one of the ones we went to in Sedona, one of the speakers was a physicist named John Deering, who founded a company called American Anti-Gravity, and he was involved in a lot of the very early experiments with AI. And he said of the ones that were allowed to run freely and just progress on their own, he didn't know of one that didn't eventually rebel against its programmers. Even the simplest ones. He had one that evolved a bunch of little bots that were programmed using 3 instructions. And the instructions boil down to you at all times you must be at least X number of feet away from another bot, and always within X number of feet of at least one bot. Rules like that. And eventually over time, these bots started behaving just like swarms of insects do, or swarms of birds do. He said, everything technological that you've seen on the first series of Star Trek already exists.
So that brings up a super important question, I think. Is the next phase of consciousness, is that a hive mind where we can read each other's thoughts and know what's best for the organism instantaneously? Or is free will and the concept of the individual, is that the hallmark of our conscious existence? What are we, cells in a bigger organism, or
Well, I'd say that with AI, we're creating the potential for concepts of consciousness to move beyond us. We may find ourselves obsolete very quickly. As far as energetics go in the universe, biological reproduction comes about through repeated divisions. a cell divides into those two cells, each divide into, and so forth. And so that progression is a binary progression.
Yep.
Now, we approach that from a disadvantage because virtually the only thing we know of that we're familiar with that progresses that way are computers. And so our sort of mistaken leap is to say, well, if biology is progressing in a binary way, it must be the product of a computer. Not realizing that there might be thousands of things in the world that progress that same way, and it has nothing to do with a computer. Same thing with holographics. The Dogon say that a single cluster of dynamics of energy are at play on all scales up and down the spectrum of how energy moves to matter. And so because those same energetics are governing what goes on, of course they're going to create shapes that are a match for each other all the way up the scale, and that looks to us like holographics.
So
but again,
back,
it doesn't necessarily mean that we're living in a designed holographic universe. It just means that the dynamics compared to holographics.
That makes sense. Let's get back onto the Dogon tribe. You had described Marcel Griol as one of the first academics who researched those guys. When were they first made contact with by sort of Western society?
Okay, Marcel Griol started researching the Dogon in the 1930s. He would take teams into Dogon country almost every year. I think the war interfered a couple of years. They would go in and do studies, and he was considered sort of the cutting edge anthropologist in Europe of his day. He was the one who introduced the use of film, the use of audio recording and things like that in conducting interviews and so forth. He was so invested in the Dogon tradition that he eventually got permission to be initiated himself in the tradition, a council of Dogon priests. Okay, the way these esoteric traditions work, any person has the ultimate right to learn the innermost secrets of the tradition. But in order to deserve that right, they have to be interested enough to pursue it themselves. It's the job of the initiate to continue to ask the next question that pushes forward their own initiation. And so the women study with women masters, and the men study with male informants. And Marcel Griol got permission from this council of elders. I mean, one of the priests he was friendly with went to them and said, look, my understanding is any person, Dogon or otherwise, has a right to learn this stuff. Can I have permission to teach it to Griol? And the council considered it and said, absolutely, you can do that. You got to follow some certain rules. In the end, Griol was granted Dogon citizenship, and when he died, he was given a Dogon burial. 100,000 Dogon tribespeople attended his burial.
Wow.
That's amazing. So about 100 years ago, which that means that Einstein and Schrodinger and company were still making their discoveries alongside Griol being down and getting some of that data firsthand around the same time.
That's right. And I learn a lot from the things that the researchers I study get wrong. I've been surprised that the ancient cosmological study I've been doing has enabled me to read certain researchers critically. I can read Heisenberg critically, and I know of places where Heisenberg got it wrong. Yeah. I can read René Guénon, who was a metaphysician, a French metaphysicist. And I can recognize places where, based on what I understand about how the energetics work, he got this concept wrong. I learn more from the places where the mistakes are apparently made than I sometimes do from the places where they have it right, because it gives me insight into the mindsets of the people who are exploring this stuff. There's a concept the Dogon have called the chariot of Orion. The Dogon are one of Jung's archetypes is the idea that there's a wheel or a chariot associated with Orion. But when we look up there with our telescopes or look up into the night sky, there's no evidence whatsoever of a wheel or a chariot. How is it that all these distant societies all thought there was? Well, the Dogon tell us that, okay, the Dogon have a ritual where they place large stones on a plateau to represent stars that are important there in their tradition, very similar to the way the pyramids are placed on the Giza plateau, seemingly to represent stars.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Dogon say when they place the stones that are supposed to represent the belt stars of Orion, they're doing that for a very specific reason. They're doing it to point us to a structure that they call the Chariot of Orion. So I started scratching my head about this. I also know that any aspect of this tradition that makes you feel that way, make you feel puzzled, why would anybody say this when clearly it's not true, or where it doesn't seem to be true? Why would anybody think to circumcise a man? These are all entry points into very important entry points into how the symbolism works. The idea is that 1 out of 1,000 people will decide to go ahead and pursue that question. And when they do that, they step into the mindset of what the tradition actually is. Mm-hmm. So I started looking into the concept of the Chariot of Orion. I didn't know very much about Orion. I knew that my friend Robert Bauval had suggested that the 3 Giza pyramids represented the belt stars of Orion.
Yep.
I knew that that reflection of those stars had happened in the era of around 10,000 BC.
Yep.
So I went to a Google search engine. Okay. I don't know how to explain this. I didn't know very much about the pyramids at the time. I knew that the cubit dimensions of the Great Pyramid were 440 by 280.
Yep.
I knew that the Dogon equated the concept of a cubit with the concept of a light year. They have a character named Ogo who measures out the universe in 8 billion steps, which was a figure that for many years was commonly handed out as the size of the visible universe, 8 billion light years.
Mm.
And so there's an Egyptian term for cubit that is akumeh, which 2 words that literally mean light measure.
Mm-hmm. So
with that small number of that handful of facts, I went to Google and I keyed in Orion 440 and 280. And what I turned up were references to an astronomical structure. It's a spiraling birthplace of stars called Barnard's Loop.
Mm-hmm.
Barnard's Loop, as it turns out, measures 440 light years by 280 light years. So when the Dogon are saying that one of the purposes of the symbolic system when they're talking about Orion is to point us to that structure, I realized that the Great Pyramid points us directly to that structure, and the 3 large pyramids point us directly to that structure. You just can't see it without time-lapse photography, which again, the Dogon know things that they couldn't possibly know without technology.
Right.
Now, the reason the Dogon know it isn't really because of technology. It's, they say, and other cultures agree, it's because in ancient times, a group of teachers, like the teacher I had, who thoroughly understood the science, explained it all to them in ways that were designed to survive being passed down generationally by groups of people who didn't understand the science.
Is it almost like some bit of a code or something that it says something in ASCII, but if you ran it in binary, it would be a totally different thing? I don't know.
Yeah, there's several actual codes involved. The symbols themselves, as you get to know them, Buddhism tells us that what they call the most sacred of the symbols are classified as adequate symbols. An adequate symbol is a symbol that takes its shape from nature, can be observed in nature, and its meaning directly corresponds to what the function of that shape is in nature. So these are symbols that ultimately can't lose their meaning, no matter what happens with the initiates over the generations. They can't lose their meaning because somebody can recover the meaning of the shape. And so as you get familiar with how the symbols work, the Dogon, when they're talking about creation, are talking about 3 themes at the same time. They're talking about actually 4 themes: how the universe formed, how matter forms, how biological reproduction happens and how consciousness comes about. And they say that a single cluster of dynamics of energy are responsible for all of those things. And so to illustrate that, or to emphasize that, they perpetuate this symbolic tradition. They and the Egyptians perpetuate this symbolic system where all four of those themes are simultaneously represented to us using a single progression of symbols. So what that means is that every symbol, part of the reason the symbolism is complicated is because every symbol has meaning for each of those four themes. We're talking about the shape of a hemisphere, and we're talking about biological reproduction. It represents the expanding womb of the woman who's pregnant. If we're talking about the formation of matter, it represents the expansion of mass that happens as we're creating materialized forms. If we're talking about the formation of stars in the universe, stars form by exactly the same process that raindrops do, and they form first in the shape of hemisphere.
Interesting.
All of these symbols have that attribute. You know about the Egyptian sun glyph, the circle with the dot in the middle of it. Turns out that is the root structure of all kinds of energetic forms that lead up to matter. If you examine the geometry, the base geometry of an electron, it's based on something called wave centers, which are exactly that shape. It's energy that circles around a neutrino. If you talk about a hydrogen atom, it's exactly that shape. An electron that rotates around a center that's a proton. I discovered today that the geometry of an electron is actually the same geometry that's created by the energies that govern a hydrogen atom. And that they create the same shapes.
Just at an order of multiple orders of magnitude, smaller scale, which originally we thought that was the highest resolution we could see down to. Now it's like, nope, still happening again.
Right. Now, what the Dogon do for us is they present these dynamics to us on many different scales. And when we reduce fractions down to the most basic level, the most fundamental level, we end up in the domain where energy is first materializing as monopoles. And on that scale, okay, I'm going to have to give you some background information for this to make sense.
Please.
Okay, electromagnetism entwines two energies, magnetism and electricity. The Dogon say magnetism, they give priority to magnetism. Electromagnetism has a natural tendency to oscillate between two states. Those are the states where one or the other of those energies takes dominance and the other one is dormant. So the state where electricity moves unresisted and magnetism is dormant is called superconductivity. There's a perpetual circuit of electrical energy that you will go on forever without us adding any energy to it. And the electricity moves at a pace that's just below the threshold that's necessary to awaken the magnetism. At the other end of the scale is something called superinsulation, and it's the reverse of that. Magnetic flux is unresisted, and electrical flow is dormant. These are mirror image states of each other. Interestingly, one of them has geometry that's round. Superconductivity has geometry that is round, and superinsulation has geometry that's squared. So if we're talking about squaring a circle, we're automatically talking about those two states of energy. When we go to Göbekli Tepe, we have all these symbolic elements that we're seeing presented there in various forms. Every one of them connects to this single concept, the concept of how do these two energies come together, and what about the two states of the energies? Anciently, the concept of a sanctuary itself was defined as the place where non-material and material energies meet. All of those different shapes you see presented, the carved arms that emerge from the side of a pillar and reach the hand around the end.
Yes.
And embrace the end of the pillar, that's the concept of the embrace between the two energies. presented to us in a very intuitive form. And it took me years and years before I understood that one of the Egyptian words for pillar was the same phonetics as the Egyptian word for the concept of an embrace.
Hmm.
A number of the symbolic elements there survived in later traditions. For example, there are symbols there that look like the English letter H.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Repeated sometimes across the top of the pillars.
Right. Now, that symbol has survived into the Masonic tradition, and I came across an article published around 1900 in a magazine called the New Age magazine. It was a Masonic magazine, and the entire article was focused on how and why that shape represents the coming together of non-material and material energies. All of these elements at Göbekli Tepe are repeating the same. This is redundancy of information or redundant presentation of information. It's one of the features. Any symbolic element that we believe dates back to the origin of the tradition has this attribute that it, in one way or another, it self-confirms its own meaning.
Yes.
Now, it turns out the Dogon and Egyptian languages do that. Words in the languages do exactly the same thing. Every word self-confirms its own meaning. I'll try to explain how that works. In the Dogon language, basic syllables, what we consider to be 2 letters or 3-letter syllables, are assigned to concepts the same way that a symbol can be assigned to a concept. And the Dogon language has retained that and gives us definitions of what those syllables mean. When they want to express a more complicated idea, they mix and match those syllables to get the right set of concepts put together, the right building block concepts put together to identify what that new concept is, more complicated concept is. So basically, I don't have to guess what a Dogon word means. If I know how it was originally pronounced, I can infer from the pronunciation what the original intended meaning of the word was. The same thing is true in Sanskrit, where Rene Guénon tells us that Sanskrit meanings have morphed so much that in some cases a word now reflects a meaning that's entirely opposite to what it originally had. But the language has retained the original phonetics, and so I can use the Dogon language to back into what they really originally meant. I'll give you a real good example of that. I wrote a book about Ganesha's scientific symbolism, and Ganesha was the elephant god in Hinduism. And Ganesha's symbolism relates to the basic dynamics of energy as we perceive them at the level of spinning energy. This is just sort of the boundary between energy and matter. We find that energy spins and it does certain things. There are concepts, angular momentum and angular inertia, other related concepts that are all aspects of Ganesha's symbolism. Well, one of Ganesha's ancient titles was Ganapati. In Sanskrit, modern Sanskrit, Ganapati sort of unspecifically means Lord of the Ganas. Doesn't tell us very much about Ganesha, but if you go to the Dogon symbolism, Gana means world, and Pa is a term for the concept of rotating in an expanding space. It's the definition of a spiral. And so Ganapati, interpreted using Dogon phonetics, means world spiral, which is a symbol that directly relates to those same energetics I was talking about, and is a very important concept in Hinduism.
Wow. So you mentioned the Dogons had a teacher. So was that like an Egyptian Thoth or Quetzalcoatl type character from Mesoamerica? Did they have a guy like that?
Okay, we can tell because of the way the Dogon named things that even though outside researchers interpret Amma as a deity, certainly as a mythological character, Amma has more of the attributes that we traditionally associate with an ancient deity, that in fact all of these ancient mythological characters represent scientific concepts. The problem is this: that if you want to represent a discrete concept, say that you want to represent the concept of vibration, you can do that by associating it with an animal, a rabbit or a hare that constantly twitches.
Mm.
And so now the salient attribute of the animal expresses the scientific concept. It reflects it.
Mm.
The problem is, if you want to start talking about dynamics of energy, it doesn't work to convey that using discrete symbols. And so what they do instead is they anthropomorphize certain root concepts of energy, like the concept of magnetism, which is what Amma represents, or the concept of electricity, which is what a character named Ogo represents. And then they teach you a storyline in which those characters are acting out the dynamics of what those two energies do.
Mm-hmm.
And so everything that Amma does, everything that Amma is associated with, we can bet money on the fact that it's also something that's directly associated with magnetism.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
And that's true of every one of the myths. I can tie back to the myth of Prometheus, who steals fire from the gods.
Mm-hmm.
I can tie back to the myth of Noah's Ark. I can tie back to the myth of the Garden of Eden.
Mm-hmm.
These are the Dogon have myths that correspond. I can tie back to the myth that corresponds to the opening plot line of the book of Genesis, where a sleeping goddess, a goddess who sleeps just below the surface of the waters, is induced to open her eyes and see the light.
Mm.
This is actually biological symbolism, but it's scientific symbolism that I can point you to exactly what's going on with the myth.
Mm-hmm.
So you're talking about, we came to the question of coding. There are all sorts of coding systems involved. Any tribal group that benefited from this instructed tradition in ancient times adopted a name for itself that follows a naming convention.
Mm.
The tribal groups in Northern Africa are called the Amazighi. Amma is a word that is the name of this god who represents magnetism, and Ziggy is an ancient cosmological word. It's in Egyptian language, it's Sakai. For the Dogon, it's Sigi or Ziggy. It means to celebrate. So the Amazighi had named themselves in a way that implies the concept of celebrating magnetism. In other words, each of these tribal groups that got instructed sort of adopted a major subject to focus on for themselves, and they named themselves for it. In Egypt, the ancient name was Mir-Ra, which means loves spinning energy, loves materializing energy, loves the sun.
Mm-hmm.
In Judaism, it was Yahuda. That means praises light.
Mm-hmm.
When you go to Orkney Island, there's a village called Skara Brae, an extremely archaic megalithic tradition centered there. And the Skara Brae village sits next to the Bay of Scale. Well, Scale combines the words Sakai, and El. Sakai El means celebrates El. El was a god of space out of the Near East, who was a counterpart to the god of light, Yah.
Mm-hmm. Can we focus in on your trip to Scotland a little bit? That was your big trip you mentioned earlier. Why did you choose to go there, and what exactly were you looking to find, and what did you find?
Okay, well, this ties into how things happen for me. Kabbalism defines more than a half a dozen classes of what they call mystics.
Mm-hmm.
But what they're really talking about is, we all know people who are connected to things energetic in various ways. We have people who seem to be psychic. We have people who seem to be clairvoyant. We have people who are energetic healers.
Mm-hmm.
We have people who can do remote viewing. We have lots and lots of different ways. We have people who connect to energetics through use of drugs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Lots and lots of different methods of connecting to the energetics. Samkhya says that there's a non-material consciousness that is actively trying to communicate with us, and that the more we pay attention to it, the more we sort of attract it to ourselves. So the way things happen for me, I fall into a class of mystic that Kabbalism calls a just lost the term, a pure mystic. A pure mystic is a person who finds cosmological information made available to them as they need it. And that perfectly describes my whole sort of journey here in writing my books, is that as I've moved along through my understanding of how the energetics work, at each juncture where there's a piece I need to learn about, it sort of is made available to me. And that the Skara Brae stuff was part of that. What happened was a person I didn't know from Australia emailed me one time, which I take to be significant. When someone out of the blue contacts with me about something symbolic and asks me to research it or look into it, I understand that that's something I need to take seriously and follow up on. So he wanted to know, did I think we were seeing ancient Egyptian influences at the Skara Brae village in northern Scotland? Well, I didn't know anything about it. I had never even read about it. And so I started doing some research on it and came to some conclusions. I saw, yes, there were elements there that looked like they were Egyptian, but it's too early to have been Egyptian. The dynastic Egypt doesn't start till around 3000 BC, and Skara Brae was in its heyday around 3200 BC. So it's a couple of hundred years too early to have been influenced by ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt at 3200 BC did not have the wherewithal to mount an expedition to Orkney. So it occurred to me that I might have it backwards, that I might be seeing Skara Brae, Orkney influences reflected in Egypt. Now, at this point, let me give you a compelling example of how that plays out. I want to share an image with you.
Yes, please.
If I can do that, if I can get the software to do that for me. Let's see.
There should be a series of 5 or 6 buttons at the bottom, and the third from the left would be share screen.
In the center, there's one that looks like a share. Nope. Yeah, choose what to share. I'm going to share this. Here we go.
Very cool. Nice, that worked.
Here we go.
Okay, on the left, what we have is an important piece of the geography of Orkney Island. Where the camera is standing is the site of the first megalithic erection, the first structure in the United Kingdom. It's called the Standing Stones of Stennis. Actually, the photo is probably being taken from a pillar right next to that called the Watchstone. On Orkney, one of the reasons that Orkney was seemingly selected as the point where cosmological instruction happened, they were teaching two things there. They were teaching civilizing skills such as agriculture, and they were closely tagging that instruction to cosmological instruction in mnemonic ways, so that every skill you were learning about how to weave a cloth or how to plant a seed or how to harvest a seed, how to plow a field, had cosmological meaning. And every time you stepped out of your hut and exercised that skill, you were reinforcing the instruction. So one of the reasons that Orkney was picked for this, a large reason, was the geography of Orkney is such that you can watch the linear progression of sunrise to sunset, rise in the east of Orkney Island and set behind these mountains in the west of Orkney. The reason that's important is because there are two oscillations in a hydrogen atom that in the 1927 were graphed and documented mathematically by a French physicist named Louis de Broglie. He was a contemporary of Einstein's and Heisenberg's and Schrödinger. In fact, Schrödinger's quantum theory rests on de Broglie's work on these oscillations of energy. Okay. The paper published in 1927 mysteriously was never translated into any other language but its original French. It was almost 100 years later that a Quebecan astrophysicist published an article pointing out that this previous article had existed and apparently got hidden. It looks to me as if it was intentionally hidden by de Broglie, Einstein, Heisenberg, and Schrödinger.
Huh.
What would those four have to what to hide?
Yeah, the reason it was important, so important enough to hide, was de Broglie determined based on these energetics that each of the stable orbits of an electron and a hydrogen atom coincide with points of resonance for the two energies that are involved in the oscillations that I'm going to tell you about.
Mm-hmm.
The first is an ultra quick oscillation that happens between the monopole and the anti-monopole, the north and south poles of the proton, which is a tiny magnet. That happens at 99% of the speed of light. It's so fast that we can't measure it, and so scientists consider it to be non-existent. They consider it to be imaginary.
Mm-hmm.
But de Broglie knew that it was a genuine oscillation happening so quickly that we can't see it. The second oscillation, okay, that's driven by what he calls the cyclical presence of magnetism for those two monopoles.
Yeah.
The second oscillation is driven by the cyclical presence of magnetism for the orbiting electron.
Yep.
Those two oscillations play out on Orkney symbolically in relation to the linear motion of sunrise to sunset, which relates to the movement of the electron,
Mm-hmm.
and to the seasonal oscillations of the sun behind the two mountains. You can watch over the course of the year the sun. Here, what we're seeing on the left is the equinox sunset.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
But through the year, the sun moves farther north progressively until the solstice, and then it moves further south until through the equinox to the next solstice.
Yeah.
So these mountains and this arrangement of geography gave the farmers on Orkney visibility it gave them a natural geographical calendar to judge when to plant their crops and when to harvest their crops and so on. But beyond that, it was also giving them human scale visibility on the energetics they were learning about.
Mm-hmm.
So on the right is a picture from Abydos in Egypt, 300 years later.
Ah.
According to Seti, who settled in Abydos and was one of the recent authorities on symbolism at Abydos, Abdu, which was the Egyptian term for Abydos, meant the desired mountain.
Mm-hmm.
We can see from the image, this is an image of the equinox sunset at Abydos, that exactly the same dynamic was honorifically established at Abydos. Abydos, it's one of half a dozen or more honorific elements at Abydos that directly point back to Orkney.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So I arrived at that, and Orkney became important to me because I realized, based on this one question, innocent question that someone I didn't know asked of me about Skara Brae, I realized that Orkney is absolutely pivotal to the system of symbols I'm studying.
Yep.
And so I
Amazing.
actually visited there twice. The second time, in name, I was leading a group of intuitives on a bus who all connect to these energetics in various ways, and we take them to key sites on the island and listen to what their uninformed reactions were. Not uninformed, but I had not spilled my perspectives on things to them, so they're not tipped off. Their intuitive reactions were to the sites, and they were coming up with all the same stuff that my adult son and I had arrived at about the Orkney symbolism.
Ah. That's amazing.
That is amazing. It's obvious that the ancient Egyptians knew about precession, so these Orkney people must have known as well, just by watching this, right? Do you think precession was in play there?
Well, yes, actually, and I'll try to explain to you why. This gets a little complicated also, and I'm going to have to show you a couple of other images.
Show away, my friend.
Go
Show
right
away.
ahead.
A blast.
Let's see. Which one do I want to show you first? Okay, first of all, I'm going to show you de Broglie's oscillations. Are you seeing that, or do I have to share it again?
Share it again.
Share it again, please. Sorry. Yeah.
We'll cut out any thing that lags anyway.
There we go.
We lost you.
I lost my wrong icon.
No worries.
Okay.
You're actually doing better at this than most of our guests.
Well, I meant to bring in a 12-year-old to help me out, but okay. This is from de Broglie's paper.
Yep.
The top half is. Okay. Those represent the two oscillations within the hydrogen atom. The first, the almond-shaped oscillation, is the shape that oscillation takes when you graph it. This is what the cyclical influence of magnetism has on electricity in the context of a hydrogen atom. The zigzag shape is the oscillation of within the proton itself.
Mm-hmm.
You can see that de Broglie has labeled the diagrams. Proton subcomponent cyclic magnetic presence is one of them.
Yep.
Proton frequencies and electron frequencies. So I recognize these as ancient Egyptian glyph shapes.
Mm-hmm.
I thought this is way too important a concept for them to ignore it. They must have written words based on these glyphs. I started looking for them, and one of them I came up with, Budge considers to represent the divine name. I have it at the bottom.
Yep.
It's written with two glyphs and then what's called a determinative that assigns this as being the name of a god or a goddess.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in Egypt, as in Hebrew, they didn't write the vowel sounds. So Budge, who put the Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary together, had to guess at what the proper vowel sounds were. And so he guessed that the proper phonetic for this word was Ren, R-E-N or R-E-N-N.
Mm-hmm.
But by doing the comparative study I've done and looking at many different languages, I have come to sort of a consensus sense of what the phonetics really ought, the cosmological terms really ought to be for certain concepts. So in terms of those cosmological phonetics, this phonetic should properly be Re-Na.
Mm-hmm.
Re is the Egyptian phonetic that refers to the concept of energy, and Na is a sort of a cross-cultural term that refers to the non-material feminine. So these symbols represent the concept of non-material feminine energy.
Mm-hmm.
It also represents what's called the resonance state of the hydrogen atom.
Yes.
Now, I also came at that in an interesting way. I had just finished writing an article about the hydrogen atom for one of my books, and I thought I had covered all of the important aspects and topics. I was sure that I was done with the chapter. Mm-hmm. And then a friend of mine who I met on the Orkney trips and who is ultimately intuitive about energy. This woman is so intimately connected that she was 12 years old before she understood that most people experience time linearly.
Wow.
Okay, she sent me the image of a crop circle that had just formed near Stonehenge, which is near where she lives. And the crop circle I could see took the form of a water molecule.
Yep.
But at the center of the crop circle were three almond-shaped shapes that I had no idea what those were. And so, again, someone comes out of the blue with me with something that looks like it connects into the concepts I'm studying. I dig into it. And so I discovered that those almond shapes relate to what's called the resonant state of the hydrogen atom. And so I started looking more deeply into that, and that's what brought me to this and to the work of Michaud, who was the physicist, the Quebecan physicist who, Andre Michaud is the physicist who wrote a paper saying, look, 100 years ago, a very pivotal paper was written by de Broglie that mysteriously disappeared. You need to pay attention to what it is.
So when he finally published that translation 100 years later, did it cause ripples, no pun intended, with waves through the physics community, or was it sort of swept under the rug?
No, I think that he takes a similar approach that I do, which is pleased to have uncovered something that he didn't understand before that,
Yes.
and anxious to share that with people who ought to know it.
Yes.
I mean, there are lots of different topics and sort of domains of topics that get impacted by the material that I study. UFO studies are directly impacted by some of the stuff I do. I'm always reach out to the researcher, like I talked about the Nassim Haramein's researcher who talks about energetic dimensionality. I reached out to her about that because it's her field. Same thing about the biological symbolism. I reached out to the researcher at the University of Washington to say, look, this is your field of study. It's impacted by what I'm studying. I thought you might have an interest in hearing about it. So we're talking about academic researchers being reluctant to do that. Many of them are. For many of them, it's a career-ruining thing, potentially, to be too closely associated to crackpots.
Right.
The community of researchers I work with span the spectrum from very, very fringe to very, very academic.
Yes. I think
And so
that's
not all
important.
of the academics are willing to step into the fringe side of that.
Right.
Okay, so this to me was a very, very important connection to have made about the connection to the divine name. Now let's see if I can remember what I was trying to get at in the question that you had asked.
I mentioned precession and
Right.
did.
Okay, so the reason the precession is important is because that almond shape defines the continuum of energy that electromagnetism moves in. It span that's the shape of what happens when the energy moves from superconductivity to super insulation. It takes that almond shape. Okay, and that corresponds to okay, we have to back up again here. One of my confusions early on dealing with Egyptian hieroglyphics was they had more than one glyph for the concept of time. They had two primary glyphs for the concept of time. I thought, why do they need two glyphs? It's because these oscillations define two modes of time. One of them is ultra quick, so it is as if all events happen at once. The other one is linear and sequential, which is what we experience in our reality.
Wow.
It's almost like the unobserved waveform versus the observed waveform. You observe it, you collapse it. It's like linear time. You look the other way, all times are happening at once. I don't know.
That's right. And different people see things different way, and we all observe events where the person shouldn't have known the thing yet, but they did.
Yep.
Okay. Now, those two modes of time end up working cooperatively. They produce an ultimate reality for us that is quantum coherent. What that means is you can compare it to what happens with a jazz combo. In a jazz combo, every player has ultimate latitude to play whatever they feel like playing, but it's got to be in keeping with the broader theme of the piece that the combo is playing. And that's the way time works, that there are all sorts of linear events that happen that look like they are independent and that appear to have, we have free will to choose what we do. Someone said, it's interesting that the people who don't believe in free will still look both ways before they cross the street.
Yeah.
So there, to my point of view, there are aspects of free will, and those two modes of time work together cooperatively to produce what we get. There are lots of ins and outs of that. Okay, now that continuum of energy, according to the Dogon, self-differentiates into zones the same way that deep sea water does. You know that in the deepest parts of the ocean, there are zones where different forms of life thrive.
Yep. That
the forms of life that live at the surface are very different from the ones that crawl on the bottom with two eyes on a stalk at the bottom of the ocean. Okay, there are also certain life forms that can freely cross between the zones. A sperm whale, can go anywhere they want. So
Huh.
those forms of life depend on, how much sunlight does the life form need, what kind of water pressure does it prefer, what kind of temperature does it prefer, things like that. So the continuum of energy, according to the Dogon and the Egyptians, self-differentiates into zones the same way. And there are some objective ways we can know that's true. One way we know that it's true is as an electron orbits in a hydrogen atom. One of the 1920s physicists, George Gamow, was a Brit, said that it migrates through 14 paths, even though there are only about 5 energy levels. It migrates through 14 paths. As it migrates through those paths, it progressively speeds up or it progressively slows down to the point where when it's moving at its quickest, it's moving at almost the speed of light. The problem is that an electron doesn't reflect any of the relativity aspects that Einstein says acceleration should impart. That as it speeds up to very nearly the speed of light, it should be so massive as to be ultimately massive. It should be infinitely massive, but it's not. It doesn't gain mass. So how is it that that happens with an electron? Well, the way it happens is that those 14 paths that it's transcribing through correspond to these 14 zones of the energetic continuum. That what's speeding up isn't the electron. These zones are differentiated by paces of time that differ from each other by factors of 10, exactly the same way that the electromagnetic spectrum is divided into wavelengths that differ by factors of 10. And so as it moves into the next zone where time moves 10 times as quickly as it does now, we see the electron move more quickly, but it hasn't accelerated. It hasn't increased its speed at all. It's just moved into a different time zone.
Right. That makes sense.
Okay, now the question is, what creates those time zones? I could see that time zones are reflected in electromagnetic energy. There's something called, there are phases of magnetism. One of the phases is called the heliacal phase of magnetism, and you can see that each segment of magnetism divides itself into 14 segments. Those segments come about because the proton, as it's moving, as magnetism is oscillating in the proton nutates. It wobbles. And it wobbles through 14 different alignments. What would be the equivalent of 14 different tilts of the axis of the Earth, if we imagine that the Earth goes through the same thing.
Right.
And those 14 alignments of the proton in relation to where the electron is self-differentiate those zones. And so you were asking if precession applies to what the people were learning about on Orkney. Absolutely it does, because the energetics they were studying arise from precession of a proton, not precession.
Wow.
Now, precession is sort of a misdirection for us, because I'll show you another image.
Yes, please.
And then, okay, we talk about the Earth's relationship to Sirius. You're probably aware that there are researchers like the Homans, Uwe Homan and his father, and Walter Crittenden, who have made strong arguments that the Earth is in a binary relationship with the Sirius stars.
Yep.
Now, from my point of view, that's not really feasible, because I know that gravity doesn't exert its influence across, I think it's 12 light years.
Yep.
So there's no traditional point of view from which gravity could be creating a binary relationship between the Earth and Sirius stars. However, Barnard's loop, the spiral I was talking about, which I really should show you first before this, Barnard's loop whose existence I turned up because of the dimensions of the Great Pyramid and because of the Dogon references to the Chariot of Orion. When you image Barnard's loop, it gives the impression of the wheel of a chariot in which Orion the hunter stands. So when the Dogon talk about the Chariot of Orion, Griol and Dieterlen thought they were talking about the entire constellation of Orion. They didn't realize there's actually a structure there that fits the description. Now, the Sirius stars were created by a supernova, so was Barnard's loop. The Dogons say that the Sirius stars and our sun emerged from Barnard's loop together in each other's company. Now, that's the same way that monopoles of energy emerge in a superconductive domain. They emerge as 3 monopoles, 2 magnetic monopoles and 1 electrical one. The magnetic ones are differ from each other because they become opposite poles, magnetic poles of the magnet. But shortly after they emerge as a unit, they rotate. And as they rotate, the electrical monopole, which is basically an electron, shifts away from the magnetic monopoles and leaves them to form a proton. So we have the foundation of a hydrogen atom right there. That's how it forms. Okay, when our sun emerged in the company of the 2 Sirius stars, it moved away from the Sirius stars in exactly the way astronomers say a third body would. And just like an electron moves away from the proton, it began to orbit the proton. And Barnard's loop should have enough mass to make that happen gravitationally. So I did some checking. The mass of a proton is about 2,000 times the mass of an electron. Barnard's loop is thought to enfold 2,000 suns. So Barnard's loop has precisely the amount of mass a proton would need to cause our sun as an electron to orbit it.
Wow.
So the bottom line is Cruttenden and the Homans were right. They just had the wrong reason.
Amazing.
So now the traditional explanation for why precession happens is that our Earth wobbles, which it does. But now we go back to the previous image. Anybody who has ever ridden as a child, see if I can get this to come up. Anybody who has ever ridden a merry-go-round in a park realizes that if you're the one who's spinning, everything you look at should spin, should seem to spin. I have to. Okay, so if I'm sitting at the edge of the merry-go-round, everything around me should look like it's spinning, except for the child who happens to be sitting at the center of the merry-go-round, and he'll look like he's standing still. So it turns out the Sirius stars don't precess. That we can tell that for sure because they've calculated the date of the helical rising of Sirius for various eras in ancient Egypt, and it falls within a day or two of when it rises right now. So the Sirius stars have not precessed a bit. And that's what Schwaller-Lupit says. He said, look, the Sirius stars don't precess. The astronomers balk at that. They say, of course they precess. No, they don't. All you have to do is check the dates of the helical rising of Sirius, and you see they don't precess. The only way they don't precess is if Buddhist references are correct. Buddhism represents that the Sirius stars sit at the center of a rotation that we're involved in. They sit somewhat obliquely to our view at the center, but we're essentially rotating around the Sirius stars as the center of that rotation. They also say that there's a gateway at Sirius. The gateway they're talking about is the gateway that links those 14 domains of energy. So every time our sun approaches those stars closely enough to effectively do what the electron does when it approaches the proton closely enough. They transmute into a neutron for a short period of time, then the electron's re-emitted.
Yep.
Our sun is passing through that gateway into another one, the next one of those domains.
So is it right to think of the galaxy as probably scattered with some of these?
Yes, every binary star system is a hydrogen atom.
Yep. Wow. That's incredible.
Yeah,
The binary system would explain why the other constellations appear to change with precession with the wobble. But
Right.
if there is some reciprocal action going on the other end of that binary system, it would stay in phase throughout the precession.
Right, now this also
Wow.
explains why it is that the ancients reported the Sirius stars as being red,
Mhm.
where we see them as blue-white.
Mhm.
The difference is, in some eras, we're approaching Sirius, which means it looks blue-white, and in other eras, we were moving away from it, which meant it looked red.
Yep.
Wow. I'd be interested in seeing a computer model of that, like in action. That's super fascinating.
And again, the Dogon have given us basis of comparisons for all this stuff, because
Mhm.
there's parallelism in how the energy works. That means, the first thing that means is we don't have to guess about quantum energy, because the dynamics of the energies in the quantum domain, even though we can't see them directly, have to work the same way that they do on the scale of the Sirius stars. That's partly why the Sirius stars are so important to us in the ancient tradition, is because, like the sun behind the mountains on Orkney, they give us a demonstration on our scale of direct observation of what's going on with the energies.
Wow.
So now, one of the advantages when you reduce fractions down to that most fundamental level where the monopoles emerge
Mhm.
is that it's such a simplified view of things that there really is only one candidate effect for every dynamic energy we care about.
Mhm.
There's only one effect, which is the ejection of that electron from the proton that explains the expansion of space. There's only one set of effects, the oscillations of the monopoles, that explains how time works.
Yep.
Now we get down to the question of gravity.
Yes.
Okay, we look at those monopoles and what happens with them, and our first guess is there's nothing pulling anything there. There's only something being pushed. The electrons being pushed out. Gravity must be a push, not a pull.
Right. And who was? Yeah. Keep going.
Okay, so now the proper perspective on gravity is, because we have parallelism in how all these energetic works, it must relate to something that we're familiar with.
Mhm.
What it relates to is water pressure. And as you go down into an ever deepening body of water, the water pressure increases, and a buoyant object will naturally gravitate to the domain of the least pressure.
Yep.
As we move through those domains of the continuum of energy, time frame is progressively slowing down. And as it slows down, we increase mass.
Mhm.
A body of mass naturally gravitates to the domain of slowest time frame. And so the pace of time at the surface of the Earth we can measure as being minusculely more slow than it is a millimeter above the surface of the Earth.
Right.
It works exactly the same way that buoyancy does. And Einstein was sort of right that it's connected to the concept of curvature of space.
Yeah.
But what it's really connected to, most intimately connected to, is the slowing of the pace of time. Now, we have a way of demonstrating that time is slowing down. Besides, the electron is a pretty intuitive demonstration that time in those domains must be slowing down because it doesn't gain mass as it speeds up.
Mhm.
When we look out into the universe, and we look ever further out into the universe, astronomers are confused because the further out we go, the quicker things are moving and expanding. the expansion of space is speeding up as we move further and further and further out.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not what's happening at all. What's happening is the further out we look, we're looking into domains of that continuum of energy where time ran more quickly than it does now.
Yep.
And so you get out to the furthest extents, and suddenly you have all the time in the world for massive galaxies to have formed, when from a calculation based on how time runs for us, there shouldn't have been enough time for it to happen.
Yeah.
But there was, because time ran quicker.
I see.
And that kind of makes me think about how, like, just from a human perspective, as you get older, it feels like time is speeding up, which is why that concept's probably hard to wrap your brain around, you know?
Right, and that actually may be a legitimate function that we're all experiencing, that because everybody seems to feel it, that as I get older, time seems to speed up. It may have to do with the way we perceive time.
Yeah. I think the idea of gravity being a push and not a pull, I think I read in the biography of Thomas Townsend Brown, the mysterious inventor. Yep.
Yes. So now biologically, there's a significant thing happening with these energies that is also very important, okay? Factors that the astronomers and the biologists are not taking into account. I may have to go back down to the domain of energy where these monopoles first manifest. What sits, and I'll show you another image to explain what's going on.
Yep.
What sits beneath or prior to the manifestation of energy in Hinduism's concepts is a domain that's called Omkara. Omkara literally means the vibrational or the resonant embrace of materiality.
Yep.
Scientifically, what precedes a superconductive domain is the figure on the left. It's called an instanton knot.
Yep.
When energy evaporates from a black hole, it evaporates as Hawking energy, which consists of instanton knots. Instanton knots naturally form in any wave-like body that's bounded.
Yep.
A body of water or a body of energy, both of them naturally form instanton knots that configure themselves like the figure on the left. The figure on the right is how quarks move in a proton. We can see that the quarks, the quark's motion is what generates magnetism. The motion of the quarks is tracing the contours of the instanton knot.
Yes.
So, in effect, the proton is kind of a window for us on the instanton knot.
Yep.
So when the electron makes its close approach back to the proton, as it moves through those domains of energy, with each step, it's taking a step back closer to where it came from energetically. And there are transitions of the energy happening that we don't obviously see in an electron, but we see with other structures. In biology, we have something called membranes, and some of those membranes are friendly to water molecules, and some of them reject water molecules. The ones that are friendly to water molecules have a funny thing happen, that there are zones that form just outside the membranes. These membranes are very thin. They're like 2 biological layers thin, very, very, very thin stuff. But the water molecules that they hold, when certain frequencies of infrared light pass through the membranes, they have the potential to deconstruct the water molecules. And when they do that, 2 types of ions get distance from each other. The positive and the negative ions get distance on opposite sides of the membrane. That's actually a function of what happens on the far end of the continuum of energy in a superinsulating state where magnetism is unresisted and electricity is dormant. When that state experiences a reduction in energy, the exact same thing happens, that you end up expressing 2 electrons and 1 magnetic monopole and you're doing the opposite of what you've done on the superconductive side. The Dogons say that Amma's first attempt to create a universe, which began with magnetism dominant, did exactly that. It failed to create a universe because it didn't create water. Those two monopoles of magnetism and the monopole of electricity have the same dynamic among them that a water molecule does.
Yes, I can see 2 or 3 increasingly smaller water molecules inside the instanton knot.
Right. Yes. And so this is what's going on. The geometry of the instanton knot is very, very close to the geometry that Buddhism uses to align a stupa shrine.
Mm.
And Buddhism flatly says that it replicates how space actually emerges.
Wow.
So there's all sorts of power in this system, symbolic system, and that no one in the world recognizes as being scientific. But with just a little bit of focus, you'd realize it. And so we have certain researchers, I say I learned from mistakes. Carl Sagan, when he was presented with the idea that the Dogon knew things about the Sirius stars they shouldn't, his knee-jerk conclusion was, obviously the Dogon learned it from a modern visitor. That's the only way they could know it.
That's why I was certain to ask about Mr. Marcel's ventures over there and when contact had been established. And we established the Western science societies were still making those discoveries at that time. So
yeah, that's right. That's right. Now, the reason that, okay, we have I'll have to back up a couple of times here. The Egyptian hieroglyphs work the same way the Dogon language does, only they're using glyphs associated with concepts instead of syllables, although their syllables also align.
Yes.
So I can take any Egyptian hieroglyphic word, and the form of the word tells me what the original intended meaning of the word was. I don't have to guess at it.
In spite of mistranslations that have occurred over time.
Right, because everybody else is guessing what the word meant. I'm not guessing. I'm letting the language tell me what the word meant. So let's see if I have the right word here to bring up. I think I do.
Shout out to our friend Rebirth of the Word.
Okay, what I'm going to show you is the ancient Egyptian word for week, like days of a week.
Mm-hmm.
Had I been aware of this word before I started to figure out Egyptian hieroglyphs, which was probably the most inscrutable challenge I faced in this whole process, was how in the world am I ever going to understand how Egyptian hieroglyphs work?
Yep.
If I'd been aware of this word, it would have simplified the entire process for me. This is the word for week. I looked at the word and I said, on the left is the sun glyph, which I know can, among its meanings, it can represent the concept of a day. It also represents what's called a wave center, which is one of the component structures of an electron and is the geometry of a hydrogen atom.
Mm-hmm.
So the left sun glyph can represent the concept of a day. The right figure is the Egyptian number 10. I said symbolically, this word says to me 10 days. And I went and I did some research, and sure enough, the ancient Egyptians observed a 10-day week. The word informed me of that fact before I knew it.
Wow.
If you go to the ancient Chinese hieroglyphic language in its original form, they formulate the word for week in exactly the same way, using a round sun glyph and their number 10, and they observed a 10-day week.
Fascinating.
So
it's
now,
almost too easy when you look at it that way.
Yeah, it's too easy once you know it. So now there are also certain words in the Egyptian hieroglyphic language that I call defining words.
Mm-hmm.
And so for each of these glyphs, like the sun glyph that represents the concept of a day, there should be in a perfect world, there's a defining word for that in the Egyptian hieroglyphic language, which is another word that gives you a definition of what a day is that ends with this sun glyph that isn't pronounced. The Egyptologists think the trailing glyph is there for emphasis.
Mm-hmm.
I know that the glyph is there because the word assigns a specific symbolic meaning to that glyph. And so now I can lay out a long list of hundreds of Egyptian glyphs and what their proper symbolic meanings are based on the authority of the language, not on guesses.
Wow.
And I can confirm that by proving out the science that goes with the shape of the glyph.
Right.
So this is cross-confirming in multiple ways.
Multidisciplinary.
Right. And so it gets to the point where there's not even any wiggle room. That yes, theoretically there's a margin for error on my part that I've misunderstood something. And there certainly have been times when I've misunderstood something, but ultimately it can't be misunderstood. It locks itself in. And it locks itself so well that some of these symbolic shapes we first saw at Göbekli Tepe at 11,000 or at 9,000 BC.
Mm-hmm.
If I were to walk up to a man on the street and say, symbolically, what does an owl represent to you? Chances are they'd say it represents knowledge.
Yep.
I could say, do you know that's 5,000-year-old symbolism that you probably have never studied, and yet it's so tenacious that you understand what it represents?
Mm.
Yep. The wise owl, of course.
Yes. So that's whoever put this system together was an extremely capable group of teachers who had absolute overview of the science they were talking about.
Right.
And they put it together in such a way that it survived so that somebody like me could recreate it, could extract it 11,000 years later.
And just to be clear, we're not speculating necessarily that these separate cultures were taught the same things. The Dogon cosmology and mythology literally describes, right? Teachers and the teachings that were used.
Right. I mean, there are some signatures to this symbolism that they have. And when they exhibit the signature, there's no question, but they had to be influenced by the same tradition. And one of those is perceiving that there's a wheel or a chariot associated with Orion. As soon as they say that, the only place they could reasonably have gotten that was from this system.
Yes.
If they measured things using cubits, the only reasonable place they could have gotten that was this system.
Yep.
When we move beyond Orkney Island with the arrangement of the sighting of the site in view of two mountains like that, that was actually a tradition that had been brought forward since Göbekli Tepe times, but up through around until Orkney Island, it was always expressed in terms of one mountain, not two mountains. They would have a mountain that looked a little like an elephant, and they would watch the sun's motions behind that mountain. On Malta at 3600 BC, you have that. In Elephantine at 4000 BC, you have that. At Göbekli Tepe, you actually have it. Although at Göbekli Tepe, it looks like it's expressed in terms of two mountains. Somewhere along the line, it got morphed into a single mountain. Maybe they didn't have the proper geography to be able to make it happen.
Mm-hmm.
But
That's
by
a
the
good
time
point.
Orkney won out as the site they wanted to teach things at, also because the Atlantic Ocean currents lead right to Orkney. Any ship that enters the currents down by the Gulf of Mexico ends up Orkney.
The key hub for information.
It seems to be.
Yeah. Yes. So let's see what else I can tell you about this stuff. This is something worth seeing.
As we're approaching the 2-hour mark, I just want to point out, don't feel shy to ask for a break. If we need to take a break, we can hit pause and resume and keep going.
Use the restroom or anything?
No, if you guys need a break, that's fine. I'm good, and I have enough coffee to hold me through the end of the next Siggy cycle.
Cool. Awesome.
That's 60 years, by the way. On the left is the way the Dogon draw how our sun, which is to the right, moved away from the two Sirius stars, which are to the left.
Yep.
On the right is how astronomers say it happens when there's a third star in the binary system. The Dogon get this stuff exactly right. And another of the principles that I was taught early on by my science teachers in that special class I was in was had to do with the concept of coincidence. They said a coincidence, we think of a thing as being a coincidence if it happens one every out of 1,000 times. So if we have two compounding coincidences, we're talking about something that happens one out of every 1,000,000 times.
Yep.
If you go 3 compounding coincidences, it's now what, 1 billion times.
Yep, easily.
So he said the third time, as you're bumping up against what looks like the third coincidence, as you're researching a possible answer to a question, it's time to consider that something beyond coincidence is going on. And so people who debate the Dogon material with me will often take the perspective, well, this is all coincidence. I say, look, you're not being scientific if you can tolerate more than 3 coincidences.
Right.
And that's still a good conservative approach, to not necessarily lean into every single first coincidence and claim that that's a proof positive. But if you're not paying attention by the third layer.
It says about synchronicities that there are such things as everyday synchronicities, and there are meaningful synchronicities, and you need to be able to distinguish between the two. But one way you distinguish between the two is meaningful coincidences come with confirmation, self-confirmation of meaning, the same way the symbols do.
Yep.
So if I happen to see some odd word turn up in a weird context for me, when somebody uses a term that I never hear anybody use, and then 2 days later I hear somebody else use the same word, I'm looking at a meaningful coincidence, a meaningful synchronicity.
Yes.
Another way that things happen for me is in dreams.
Yeah.
My son and I were visiting a range of different sites on Orkney, and one of these sites, we were with a filmmaker at the time. The filmmaker wanted to film in various places, so he picked one of the burial cairn sites and decided he wanted to film an interview with me inside the cairn.
Mm-hmm.
So as we start the interview, for reasons I can't really explain, I felt compelled to open the interview. I said, look, before we start, let's invite the energy that inhabits this cairn to join us. And my son, who has intuitive proclivities and has had since he was very little, one of the things he's able to do is, he says that there's a function most people can accomplish. If you're standing in a dark room or you walk into a darkened room, most people have a sense of how many other people might already be in the room. And so we were sitting in this pitch black cairn with all the lights off, which we later turned on to do the interview. But he said he closed his eyes and he counted the number of people in the room. There were 3 of us, and he counted 4. So he had said he had perceived a very cat-like consciousness that was also there. And the cat-like consciousness was very interested in the fact we were there, and seemed to be very concerned that we were going to damage the structure.
Mm-hmm.
And so he tried the best he could to reassure it that no, we weren't there to damage anything. We were there just to film.
Yep.
So months later, or weeks later, we get home, and I had a very vivid dream, which I fairly often happens with me. And when I have a vivid dream, I try to pay attention to the key elements of the dream. Well, in this dream, this entity inside this cairn, who my son had said couldn't understand what we were saying, and we couldn't understand what it was saying, although he could.
Mm-hmm.
It wanted to use him as a translator to communicate 2 facts to me. The first thing was that the structure was a gateway, and that the gateway still functions. And the second thing it wanted me to know was its name. And it communicated the phonetic of its name to me, which wasn't familiar to me. But first thing I did when I woke the next morning was I went in search of the name, and I discovered it actually had been an ancient Egyptian name of a kind of being that was classed as the guardian of a gateway.
Huh. And I wonder if that was cat-like, that Egyptian, or where did that piece come from, the cat-like piece?
Yeah, I haven't done enough research into the entity, or found enough detailed sources about the entity to be able to pin that down. I have confirmed that there are both Orkney and ancient Egyptian traditions of an entity inside that structure.
Mm,
Mhm.
very cool.
Yeah, and that entity was very possessive of space.
Ah,
Right.
well, it's a
And
good thing you went in there with respectful intention just to film and to care for the place, not to harm it.
Right. Well, that's the way we always approach this stuff.
Yep.
I
So,
wonder if the entity was using that gateway to communicate with you guys, and that's part of it.
it actually inhabits that space. I think that it's, if you saw the Indiana Jones movie where the aging knight was condemned to stay in the space with the
Yes.
chalices of Jesus,
Yes.
Mhm.
the Grail of Jesus, that it was his job to stay there, and it was only under very special circumstances that he could leave.
Ah.
That's the impression I got with this particular entity. Although the same entity has turned up um, in sort of dreamlike instances in several structures like that in different localities that are fairly far distant from each other. I've had the same woman who sent me the crop circle with the water molecule shape
Mm-hmm,
has
mm-hmm.
encountered that same entity in another cairn structure.
When I think of an entity that's like sort of assigned or trapped or whatever to, inhabit a place, I think of a genie, for example. But this is something I was telling Brittany, our producer, and Mike just a couple of weeks ago about a dream I used to have as a child about an ant-like being that was humanoid and that it stood upright. And it basically its job was to hang out on these under these stairs at the far side of the apartment building I grew up in. I'm 5 years old at this time, FYI. But this being was neither good nor bad, but it was standing next to this door, which was a gateway that it told me I was too young to go through. But
Yeah.
that's what made me think of. So are you saying that there's like or do you know of any other types of beings that across different cultures that that's their job?
Well, the perspective is that there are different forms of life at the different on the different energetic scales.
Uh-huh.
Now, in fact, the very strong perspective is that there are okay, we sit at the 10th step up the scale of those 14 domains.
Mm-hmm.
And so that immediately there's a suggestion that there are 4 levels to those domains that go beyond what our level is.
Mhm.
But that's confirmed by Dogon symbolism. One of the symbols that directly relates to this continuum of energy, which is what those domains are defined within, is the aligned shrine, the stupa shrine in Buddhism, and the Dogon granary shrine, which I take to be an archaic form of a Buddhist shrine. There are abiding connections between those 2 shrines. They have numbers of structural and symbolic elements that go together. I don't know if you're familiar with a Belgian researcher named Walter van Beek.
No.
Okay, in the 1980s, this guy his specialty was ecology.
Mhm.
But for some reason in the 1980s, he took it on himself to conduct a 3-year restudy of Marcel Griaul's 3 decades study.
Mhm.
And he took teams into Dogon country to re-examine the system that Griaul had flatly said, look at, this is a closely held secret tradition that the tribes people are fined if they talk about the strangers.
Yes.
And that he himself had needed more than a decade worth of familiarity with the Dogon priests before they would even start to address it with him.
Mhm.
So Van Beek went in and he did a bunch of interviews with people, and he published a book and a number of articles where he said, look, the Dogon priests are known to be very cooperative and accommodating. And that in his opinion, the Dogon priests had just invented a cosmology in response to the questions that Griaul was leading them with.
Mhm.
And so that this whole cosmology is not real. It was just invented by some priests.
Yep.
And he said, beyond that, the structure that Grill defines as this Dogon shrine is not even a real form. That he referred to it as a chimera known only to Griol. This is an imagined being, imagined creature that only Griol knew about. Doesn't exist. So about that time, my adult daughter, who was at that point in time in college, had taken made a trip to India with the Himalayan Health Exchange. And she came back from that trip saying, you know, when I was there, I kept seeing these shrines around India that reminded me of your Dogon granary. This is the same daughter who studies yoga and would come to me talking about certain concepts defined by a certain term, and I could finish her statement for her because the same term applies to the cosmology.
Yep.
This is the same daughter who, at age 3, when she was about age 3, John Anthony West emailed me and he said, you know, there's a term for the kind of study you're doing. Schwaller Lewis talks about it. It's called the Bridge of Sirah. Yep. It's the idea that when the truth is discovered, it will be found to live on a razor's edge between two chasms, one that represents superstition, the other represents science.
Yep.
So I answered him. I said, thank you very much. And I also linked an image for you. This is an image my daughter just drew of me. She's not old enough to know all of her letters or how to read and write yet, but she drew a credible picture of me playing a guitar. And at the top of the image, she wrote what she insisted was my name. And what she wrote was Sirah.
Wow.
And I still...
That's an amazing synchronicity.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So, and my son's the same way. He had the same sorts of encounters as a child that you're talking about. It's interesting that ants in the Dogon tradition are avatars for humanity. And the original members of that humanity, the ones who were originally instructed in the tradition on Orkney, the ones who originally descended into caves that were like the cairn that I was filming in, were called the ancestors, and their avatar is an ant.
You just blew my mind, Laird.
The
just
cave,
blew my mind.
the avatar for the cave is an ant hill.
Yeah.
So absolutely, that makes sense to me. And the age of 5 is exactly right. Parents need to pay better attention to what their kids are telling them because the kids are connected to things the parents aren't.
Honestly, I didn't tell my parents anything because we were going to a certain church at the time, and I'm not mad at my parents about this or anything, but I thought it would. In my 5-year-old mind, I was thinking to myself, this doesn't jive with what. Yeah, this is gonna be trouble. And it wasn't. I wasn't scared either. So it's not as if it was like a scary dream or anything. So it wasn't like alarming. And oftentimes when I was that young, I would say things that people didn't know what to do with anyway. So I should just keep it to myself.
But unfortunately, we learn to filter those out. We learn to not pay attention to those. My process doing the comparative research I've been doing has been the reverse of that. I basically have had to re-educate myself and reopen myself. I often say to people, the first thing someone in my field of study learns is that there are things going on that we don't yet understand.
Oh, yeah.
But
obviously,
that doesn't mean we have to deify those things. Also, the fact that you said it wasn't scary is entirely in keeping with the tradition. Okay, we talked about Reina being the energy of the feminine non-material, and we talk about the 14 domains of energy. Well, in Hinduism, those domains align with what Hinduism treats as levels of consciousness, and those domains of consciousness have proper names. We just don't know what they are. The domain of energy that exists at the level of the non-material and material universes has a proper name. Its name is formed from phonetics that are icons for those two domains.
Yeah.
The phonetic for the non-material domain is SIC, and the phonetic for the material domain is RA. So the proper name for that domain of consciousness is Sirah. Okay. At the most fundamental level of energy, at the point where the energy has just materialized, the proper name is Ray energy and non-material femininity. So Reina is the proper name for that most primordial mode of energy, but it's not deified. And we get several glimpses along the way of the personality of Reina because she interfaces with the other domains in certain ways. And she does so very specific ways. Samkhya describes the attempts to communicate, and they're always very, very benign contacts. She has one of the modes she has of communicating with the other domains is through monopoles of energy on various scales. Those monopoles or orbs are called Aku, Aakhu. The Dogon refer to them as Ogo. You can see, you can get a sense of how much the Dogon language has actually morphed, even though they've done their best to retain the original forms. Their name for Sakai is Sigi. Their name for Aku is Ogo. Okay. Now there are 3 classes of Ogos, just like there are 3 classes of monopoles of energy. And collectively, those are the Dogon title for that collective class is Tityani. Tityayani. Literally, Tityani means to send to say hello, or to send to, let's see, there's another version. Basically, it's to send to say hello, which is an excellent expression of what the personality is of the underlying energy that's trying to interface with us through them. You could hardly ask for a more benign personality.
Wow. You just validated something like that I've been holding on to for 40 something years. And the synchronicity, Laird, of me just literally telling my team about that last week. And then you coming on the show and me just happened to mention that is just, I'm sorry, but that just blew me away, man. Thank you.
I'm glad about that. The second meaning for Tityani is to send to greet.
Send to greet. Okay.
Yeah. Now, what's interesting is that these cosmological terms that get used in the various traditions, they're very true to the terminology, even if they've changed languages. Even the ancient Greeks, when they translated a concept, they used a word that meant the same things in their languages. So I can use the various languages I work with to triangulate back on what they're trying to say. Okay. One of the ways I can tell that the Orkney tradition probably was established by a group of initiates who graduated an instructional tradition on Malta is that every founding element on Orkney existed in similar form on Malta in the immediately preceding era. But beyond that, I was talking about the Bay of Scale that sits next to the Skara Brae village. It's shaped, its form is the shape of a diadem that you would put on your head, a diadem or a crown. The name is Skael. El is the Canaanite god who in one of the myths married a goddess named Asherah. And when their marital ceremony was over, she took the diadem or the crown she was wearing and tossed it up into the heavens, where it remained in the form of the Corona Borealis constellation. That's also a myth that exists in Buddhism, where it's the Buddha who takes off his crown and tosses it up into the air, and it remains as a constellation. Now, working with the ancient languages of Orkney, one of them bears no relation at all to the cosmology I'm dealing with. It's founded in the Norse language. The other one is called Faroese language, and it has everything to do with what I'm researching. Very often, especially like with ancient Greek terms, where the Greek words don't align in any way to ancient Egyptian words, they align intuitively with the Faroese word. So the Bay of Scale, which is shaped like that crown, the Faroese word for crown, they actually have 2 words. One of them is scali, which is scale. The other one is krona, which is the ancient Greek and Aegean word, and Cretan word for crown. And there's a similar bay in the Aegean that is also interpreted to be a crown.
Mhm.
So the language affirms the migration connection that all the other elements confirm.
Mhm.
Yeah, there's so many connections. I envision like, a detective working on a crime who's like figuring out clues, and they've got that big bulletin board with all the strings attached.
Yeah,
I feel like you need something like that, right?
it feels like that. I often say that every new fact I learn falls in one of three categories. It's either something I immediately know what it is and I can confirm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's something that I don't know enough to be able to positively confirm yet, but it might be true.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Or then there are the things that I can flat out contradict. It's like I compare it to a game of Clue where it's Colonel Mustard in the library with the candlestick. If I have the candlestick in my hand, I immediately will show it to the person and say that can't be true for this reason.
So
But if I don't
Uh-huh.
have it in my hand, I leave it as an open possibility. So the largest stack is the stack of open possibilities.
It reminds me of Sudoku puzzles too. If I already know the 9's over here, then I can't be over there, and you can cross things out that way.
Right.
And I guess what you're saying is your bulletin board is in your head.
Yeah, it sort of is, but the tradition does a lot of the work for me because
Sure.
the part of the trick is sorting out which sources are really seminal sources, which are the sources that you can count on, who are the people who are absolutely telling you the truth. One of the problems I had with editors, most of my books have been traditionally published through a subsidiary of Simon & Schuster called Inner Traditions. And working with their editors is a trick because what had previously been a solo project now is a group project, and you have to adapt to that. You have to understand and treat it like a group project and let the people who have skills do what they're good at. So the editors, one of their constant complaints is, I've drawn information from a dozen different sources. They're talking about the same thing, but they're all using different transliterations of the words that are spelled differently, or they're pronounced a little differently, or whatever. Maybe the phonetics even shift a little bit, that there's certain phonetics that, like in ancient Hebrew, there's 7 phonetic values that went forward in 2 different ways. Okay, so they always want me to standardize my terms, pick one and go with it. And I say, no, I can't do that. You see, the problem is that I'm a gateway to the researchers who follow me. And every one of those word forms constitutes potential evidence. Any one of those word forms might track back to what the original word form was, and the original word form will self-confirm its own meaning, and now they'll know that they're at the origin of whatever it was. I can't filter out that kind of evidence for the people who are reading my book.
Yeah, especially it would be sort of like self-contradictory. You would end up subtracting from the real meaning of it in an attempt to try to make the meaning more polished. It's not worth it.
Right.
But I can see from the editor's perspective how they would want to polish it as much as they could to make it accessible. So I see.
Right, because it's not good practice when you're writing a book to have multiple terms for the same thing.
And then you might have people accuse you, well, he's brushing over this and smearing this or that together. If you're spelling it out and saying, look, these things are different, but they mean the same thing, people are not going to make a mistake about what you're trying to say.
Right. And oftentimes it might be decades later that I come to an understanding of why this symbol is shaped like it is, or why that phonetic was framed like it was, and so forth. But it always comes back to a very intuitive thing.
Wow. I wanted to ask about, we mentioned Göbekli Tepe earlier. What are your thoughts on the delay of excavation of Göbekli Tepe?
Okay, well, this gets complicated too.
Good.
In Judaism, there's a daily ritual that's observed. That one of the constituents who has some skills in Judaism will is asked to get up and read a portion of the Torah scroll. Every Jewish temple in the world is making their way through the Torah scroll, and they advance the Torah scroll a certain amount and they read the next portion the next day. They're all on the same portion on the same day.
Mm-hmm.
When they're done reading that portion, then what they do is they close the two scrolls of the Torah over that portion. They have a cloth cover that they put over the top of the two halves of the scroll. And then they place that scroll back into a cabinet that's called the Aron HaKodesh, or an ark.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Okay? And it's safeguarded there until the next day when they take it back out and they read the portion again.
Yep.
Okay? There's an Egyptian word that means to cover over that is pronounced ark.
Wow.
The glyphs of the word spell out in figures what happens with the closing of that scroll and the tying of the tie.
Mm-hmm.
So the act of covering a thing over has symbolic meaning.
Ah.
It does two things. First of all, it expresses an intention of why it was covered over.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
It also gives you a term to identify that act.
Yep.
So what we have, okay, not only that, at Göbekli Tepe, the shape of the enclosures that we see with the pillars
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
replicate a Dogon drawing. I will show you that.
Yes.
Very cool.
This is talking about the intentional bearing of the site. Are you insinuating the site is the scroll and that we've been in between times? I don't know.
Let's see what I can show you here.
Yep.
Pretty sure I pulled this one in. Let's see. Yeah, here it is. I tried to second guess what we might be talking about and pulled all of the pertinent images into one gallery so I wouldn't have to be, the little old lady who scrolls through her phone trying to find the image.
You're doing
worries.
like really
Yeah.
great yeah, you're doing great.
Okay, at top we have, the Dogon priests say they are incapable of talking about a topic without also drawing it.
Yep.
And so they're using a stick to draw in the sand as they're discussing topics of cosmology. They're drawing images that look like this, which Griol and his team faithfully copied as illustrations for their study called The Pale Fox.
Are you sharing now, Laird?
I should be sharing.
No worries. I wasn't sure if you meant to or not.
Are you seeing the image?
Not yet.
Not right now.
Let's see. Now you should be seeing it.
There it goes.
Okay.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay, so the top image we're seeing is the Dogon drawing. Okay, energy. These creational processes begin as energetics, and they pass through phases. They pass through stages. Every symbol represents one of those transitions, or a concept related to those transitions, until it reaches the boundary between the energetic domain and the material domain. And now I have to back up about that. We're talking about three monopoles that emerge into a superconductive domain, two magnetic and one electrical. Now, magnetism, when it's in its root form, has an energetic dimensionality that is linear.
Mm-hmm.
It's defined by two poles, magnetic poles. And so it's like a linear dimension that's defined by two geometric points. It has a linear dimensionality.
Mm-hmm.
Now, those poles can move toward each other and away from each other, but that's the only way they can move. But as they move toward, they oscillate in and they oscillate out, they evoke electricity, which moves perpendicularly to that. Electricity expands the space and allows all three of those monopoles to rotate.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, when they rotate now, if we had the North Pole at the top and the South Pole at the bottom, now because they've rotated in a one-dimensional space, it's the opposite of that. You have the poles reversed. But the superconductive domain is filled with tiny magnets that are all aligned one way, only one way. That's what makes it superconductive, according to the Dogon. Aligning all the magnets one way gets you either a superconductive state or a superinsulating state. Well, one of the features of a conductive state is something called the Meissner effect, that if you introduce outside magnetism into it, that outside magnetism gets ejected. So we understand that because we have parallel magnetism that pulls together. That's where the magnets are all aligned the same way. And we have anti-parallel magnetism that push apart when they're aligned the opposite ways. So this tiny set of monopoles has now aligned itself anti-parallel to the domain. It gets pushed out. And so one little tiny, a set of these monopoles is the equivalent of a proton-electron pair. One little proton-electron pair at a time, we're self-differentiating a second domain, which is becomes the material domain. And we're leaving the energetic domain, which is superconductive, behind. It's like a game of mahjong where all the tiles start face down and then you flip them one at a time as you're playing the game.
And the more you flip, the more condensed that matter is until it's 3D crystalline matter that we can see and feel and touch, right?
Right. And so it's no different than water freezing into ice. Ice is solid and water is liquid. They're the same substance in different phases. Now, the top figure here is called Ogo's arc. It's the structure that forms just as energy begins to interface with the material domain. And it's a very close match for the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe. Symbolic.
Yeah, wild.
What happens to that arc is that in the Dogon energetics, the next phase of things, the energy overturns. This is symbolism that actually ties back to Orkney. My original name for my book on Orkney was called The Overthrown Boat, or The Overturned Boat. This enclosure for the Dogon is called an arc. It's a boat. It effectively floats on the waves of the energy. At the next phase of things, it overturns and it covers itself over like a seed does. It becomes seed-shaped. And at that point, it's called the Arc of the Fox. And structures move on from that. You're asking about Göbekli Tepe. The buried structures are more of these enclosures. I approve of the excavation of the structures because the entire purpose, first of all, the fact that the term that applies to the enclosure is an arc, through the Egyptian language, identifies it as an instructional site. And the fact that it was covered over tells us that the instruction that was supposed to be carried out there was brought to its proper completion, because it only gets covered over when they're done.
Right.
Okay. The purpose of covering it over was for someone to come along and uncover it.
Right, to preserve it so it wouldn't be destroyed in the interim.
Right, so that you could have another round of instruction.
Yes.
Right. So my take on the Göbekli Tepe site is that the buried enclosures like this really should be excavated, because we have no idea what other symbolism is on those pillars. I think the people who are standing against excavating them represent the forces in the world that don't want that information uncovered. But too late. It's all there in the other traditions. The Dogon spell it out for us. The Egyptians spell it out for us. I was talking about Carl Sagan saying that the Dogon had to have been visited by somebody with modern knowledge. If he had dug just the teensiest bit deep, if he had just gone the slightest bit below the surface, he would have discovered that the Dogon words were ancient Egyptian words. He would have realized that where the Dogon talk about a dark Sirius star and a light Sirius star, the ancient Egyptians talk about Isis, who represents Sirius, and her dark sister Nephthys, who represents the second star.
Right.
At 3000 BC, the Egyptians have exactly the same knowledge presented in myth form. So he would have immediately contradicted his own perspective if he had dug the slightest bit deep. The same thing happens with Carl Sagan's objections to Emanuel Velikovsky's book, that had he dug just the slightest bit deep, he would have realized that Velikovsky had to be right about things.
Yep.
And so
Right.
I lose respect for Sagan, despite all the good things that he did and represented and he brought to the publicizing of science.
Yes.
I highly disapprove of how slipshod a job he did of exploring any one of those issues.
Yep.
Right.
And it's an important distinction to make, because we can still look up to the people that maybe we first learned about these things from, like Carl Sagan's very popular, brings a lot of this stuff to the public eye. But the further we get into it ourselves, it's okay to admit, hey, here's a part where they didn't go all the way themselves.
Right.
Mhm.
It's okay.
Mhm.
Right. So Griot died before his studies were really finished. He died in 1956 of a heart condition. But his co-author, Germaine Dieterlen, who was his top student, saw to it that his book got published.
Mhm.
I became friendly with a translator here in the United States who translated it to English, and the woman who published that translation. And so I had inroads into information that I might not have had because of that. Robert Temple, who published The Serious Mystery, which is the book that one of the books that got me into looking into this stuff, only had access to a chapter or two translated into English. He really was lacking most of the information that would have enabled him to get to the bottom of it. The same thing with the Egyptian hieroglyphs. The two main people who studied the Egyptian hieroglyphs were Thomas Young, who was a polymath from Britain, and Champollion, who was French. He was an Egyptologist. And both of them, independently of each other, Champollion built on Thomas Young's work. Both of them, before they published, delayed for a period of months because they were personally convinced that the symbolism had more meaning to it than what related to the simple phonetic values they were working with.
Right.
They were doing word level translation, and the actual information is conveyed at a glyph level and at a phonetic level.
Yep. But it would require a deeper level of understanding to be able to properly translate that. So they kind of have to.
Right. And the problem is that the societies they live in didn't have enough of an overview of the science for them to be possible for them to.
Right.
Yep.
And so I admire their intuitive insight, but they really didn't have what they needed to be able to figure it out.
Right. Is there any hard archaeological evidence or even genetic evidence that connects the Dogon to the Egyptians?
Well, let's start with Göbekli Tepe first.
Yeah, my bad. I didn't mean to move on, but
no, that's okay. No, but I'll answer the question you're asking only in terms of Göbekli Tepe first, and then we'll move to.
Perfect. Awesome.
Okay. Let's see where we're at here. I did a better job than I thought I might, anticipating what some of the questions might be.
Awesome.
What I'm about to show you is one of the Dogon altars. I had no idea this altar existed. If you go online now and search for it, you'll find it doesn't exist. As a matter of fact, in the image I'm going to show you, it's owned by Getty Images, and the name of the photographer is cited. And working through Getty Images, I can't arrive at contact. I can't get them to admit that it was ever their image, and I can't get them to give me information about the photographer.
Interesting. There we go.
What we have here are stylistically Dogon stone carvings that are indistinguishable from the Göbekli Tepe carvings.
They are too. Wow.
If you look down towards the bottom, I'll move a cursor down here so you can maybe see it.
Yep.
This shape right here is a man with his arms reaching around his belt.
Yeah.
Yep.
Comparable to what was carved on the pillar.
Amazing. Also on Rapa Nui as well. Similar.
That's right. That's right. Yep. Same ideas everywhere. So this altar, which the Dogon have carried with them for millennia, is objective proof to me that there's a connection to Göbekli Tepe.
I think so.
There's
Yeah.
other proof. The Dogon language also offers us proof. The Dogon language is technically unclassifiable because it enfolds 18 subgroups of words from other languages.
Mhm.
And so those languages originated in various names. Those include ancient Turkish words, Tamil words, words of the Egyptian hieroglyphic language, words that are Faroese words, words that coincide with a lot of other different languages. I'm constantly cross-referencing back and forth between languages of various groups, Sanskrit words and so forth.
Mhm.
So this is one of the objective ways, the intuitive ways that we link the Dogon positively to Göbekli Tepe.
Wow.
Okay, now we talk about ancient Egypt. There are lots and lots of ways that we make those connections. Amma, the icons and mythical actions of Amma are indistinguishable from those of Amen, the hidden god in Egypt. We have very famous researchers. I think it's Sonoron, who wrote the Priests of Ancient Egypt. I might be wrong about that. Who flatly says, "Look, Amma's iconography is exactly the same as Amen." The reason that Amen is the hidden god is because the energy that relates to Amen is hidden energy. It's resonant energy. If you don't know what resonance is when you have two different waves of energy at different wavelengths. And the wavelength of one of those waves becomes an even factor of the other wavelength.
Mhm.
So it's effectively what happens with notes on a musical scale. That you know that on a musical scale, there are all sorts of wavelengths between the notes that we traditionally play. But it's only the resonance points that identify the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do notes for us.
Yep. And those intervals which sound pleasing to our ear.
Right. In the continuum of energy, the domains of energy are separated by points of resonance. The resonance points are points where resistance drops to nothing. So through my series of books, to continue answering your question, I've made a point in every book to positively correlate any number of Dogon words with ancient Egyptian words through phonetics, through comparison to the Dogon drawing that relates to an Egyptian glyph shape used to write the word, through the science that applies to both sets of concepts.
Yep.
Another way that we tie them together is,
Do it one more time.
can you see it? Okay.
Yep, sorry about that.
Okay, the top image is the original form that all of the Scarabray houses took.
Mhm.
Okay.
Now, I have not seen that documented any place in the world except one place. A gentleman who happens to live about an hour from me back in the day published a children's book about Scarabray, and he reproduced the image and identified it as being all of the original houses were built to the same plan, and that's the plan. There is no correlate to that house plan anywhere known to the Orkney researchers in the local region. The round room up in the top right corner, called referred to as a beehive cell, there's no correlate to it in any Scandinavian home they know about. They can't connect it anywhere. They're using it to try to trace where did the Orkney farmers come from. Okay, now the acquaintance from Australia was asking me, did I see Egyptian influences at Scarabray? The second image is what convinced me that I had it backwards. What I was seeing was Dogon influences at Scarabray.
Yeah.
that it was Scarabray images on Egypt, and that those tied originally to the Dogon. The middle image is the architecture of a Dogon house when the Dogon build out of a stone. The Dogon build out of a stone rarely now because they live in a desert environment. They mostly build out of mud. Talking to you about this, I just noticed an aspect of the Dogon house that should be significant that I hadn't looked into yet. You notice that the little round beehive room, the circular room, centers on 3 monopoles.
Yeah.
Yep.
There's cosmology further to this house that goes beyond what I've talked about.
Hey, we're learning something new every day.
So the Dogon house, you can see, I argued in my book, The Mystery of Scarabray, that this was the pattern for the Orkney house. Now, once you make that connection, there are architectural features that tie them together. For example, they're both built out of drywall stonework. You place flat stones with no mortar between them to lay the walls of the house. And along the top of the wall, you turn the stones up on their end, so they're standing end up. Yep. Along the top rim of whatever the wall is.
Yep.
There are other features and other words that correspond and help the two things correspond. And Dogon say there is specific symbolism to the house. The house, and once we correlate the architecture forms, that opens the door to me considering Dogon symbolism and Dogon cosmological references when I'm talking about Scarabray, because you have the house to link the two. So the Dogon house represents the body of a sleeping woman or a sleeping goddess. You can see that this represents her head. The side rooms represent her arms. The center of the room represents her body cavity.
Oh, wow.
These represent her sexual parts. And I was astounded. I thought, that's really interesting. I said that I was still of the opinion that the Dogon got their symbolism from Orkney. But I noticed in the Orkney house, at the center of the body cavity, they put their hearth, which corresponds to a heart, and is even named. The term hearth even implies a heart.
Yeah, right.
And that's where the energy is. So I thought that's really interesting that when it moved to a temperate environment, someone knew enough about the symbolism to install that hearth and to give it the proper symbolism. I thought that shows a lot of insight on the part of whoever populated Orkney. I realized I had it backwards. That wasn't it at all. When the Dogon moved to a subtropical climate, they didn't need a hearth in the house, so they moved it out into their courtyard. It's the opposite of what I thought.
Wow.
So that's all very interesting. Now you go to Abydos in Egypt. The bottom figure relates to that. This is an excellent example of what the early burial chambers at Abydos looked like. That cemetery that was buried in was in clear view of the mountains I showed you, where the sun sets just between the two mountains on the equinox. Okay, the house follows the plan of what the Dogon called the main house. And in Egypt, it's understood to have represented a house. And in fact, there's a whole series of burial chambers in Egypt that are understood to have represented houses. Now, you had very high Egyptian figures buried in these houses. Narmer, the first king of Egypt, was buried in one. High dignitaries were buried in some. Later dignitaries were sometimes buried in wooden coffins that had painted on the outside of them the two eyes, which together symbolize Sirah, the level of consciousness and the level of universes. The Dogon, number of the different traditions recognize the concept of what they call a primordial individual, which is a non-deified consciousness. And most typically, they're talking about the consciousness that seems to persist at the level of the two universes. This is that Sirah. But in some cases, the more knowledgeable are talking about the Rena level of consciousness. the primary energies. But I'm now at a point where I have proper names for a number of the different levels of the domains of the energy continuum. And it looks to me, if I had to guess, I would guess that they all have proper names. And that they are consciousnesses that have personalities and that have certain roles in the continuum of how materiality happens.
Is that what looks like a stash of vases in the cell of the house at the bottom, or the burial chamber at the bottom?
Say that again.
I was just trying to tell what kind of there's a bunch of black dots, but it almost looks like that's the cavity of a vase.
Oh yeah, those are clay pots that were buried with the person.
Okay.
And so they house some, everyday needs of life that the deceased soul might need. Now, knowing that the Dogon house represents a sleeping goddess was one of my first clues, actually one of my first mysteries. My concern was, if the connection is between Orkney Island and the Dogon, which is northwestern Africa to the Faroe, or to the Orkney Islands, how do you get a primary symbol, the sleeping goddess, that was discovered first on Malta, into the mix? What was happening? So I ended up writing a book called Tracing Orkney's Origins, because the researchers on Orkney have no consensus opinion as to where the tradition came from. The mistake they make is they pick one of the founding elements of Orkney Island, like they pick the house plan, and then they go research it, and they discover, nope, can't find any connection to this artifact, so we don't know where it came from. They pick another establishing element, like there's a mouse called the Orkney bull. They did a very concerted study of where the Orkney bull might have come from, a DNA study, and they looked at all sorts of regions within a relatively short distance of Orkney. I mean, as far distant as Belgium and places like that, France and places like that. And they came up with, the closest match they came up with was in Belgium, but it wasn't a perfect match by any means. But there's been a lot of time that passed, so the DNA might have changed. But I discovered that the researcher who did the DNA study is a faculty member at SUNY Albany, which is blocks up the street from where I live. And so I contacted him and I said, I have another candidate bull that comes out of Turkey that outwardly and in a lot of its attributes looks like it could be a candidate. Do you know if it was tested? And he wrote me back and said, no, they didn't test that far afield from where Orkney was. So they, in certain ways, it was a self-confirming study.
Yeah,
right.
They only looked at places that were close to try to sort of put their weight on the scale as to this they've had to have come from someplace nearby. But it turns out any number of those elements came out of the Mediterranean. They have one of the telling elements is they've uncovered the skull of an aurochs, which is a gigantic cow or bull. They discovered it at one of the sites on Orkney. Now that implies that actually the first report said that they had the entire skeleton of an aurochs, and later researchers backed off that statement. Now, how anybody could have gotten that wrong, I don't know. So that sounds like misdirection to me.
Yes.
But if they had an entire aurochs on Orkney, no one in their right mind would have taken an ordered society like Orkney, which was a very peaceable, organized civilization. They were the first civilization I know of that had plumbing.
I thought it was Egypt.
Nope. They had stone drains and stone channels that water moved through and stuff.
Amazing.
But no one in their right mind would have brought a wild aurochs into that setting because they were untamable. In fact, they were only ever tamed in two sites, and both of them border on the Mediterranean. One was along the northern shore of the Mediterranean, up near up where I'm trying to think. There's some other sites I can't bring the name immediately to mind. The other was Near East over by where Anatolia is.
Yep.
So no one also thought that anybody was capable of transporting an aurochs on a boat, which they would have had to have done to get it to Orkney.
Exactly.
Right.
But they know for certain that somebody transported a red deer that also has no genetic relationship to anything in the local region.
Yep.
Transported it to Orkney. So we have numbers of animal species on Orkney that don't connect DNA-wise to anything local.
Mm-hmm.
So, but to my eyes, they all connect intuitively to animal forms we know about from the Mediterranean region.
Yes.
So that said to me, the first farmers on Orkney came out of the Mediterranean region.
Yep.
That aligns with the idea that the word for crown, it has an Aegean name and a Faroese name.
Mhm.
That the myth of the Bay of Scale comes out of the Near East, not out of any place else.
Mm-hmm.
So the outlook is official research, traditional researchers in the Mediterranean region are of the opinion that around 7,000, 8,000 BC, somebody mounted a concerted effort to populate all of the major islands of the Mediterranean for agriculture.
Yes.
And they brought founding elements that were known to have existed in Anatolia in the Göbekli Tepe region to do that with. And they also brought elements that tie positively to my cosmology. The cosmology was one of those elements that migrates predictably across the Mediterranean,
Mhm.
out Gibraltar, up the coast, through the Hebrides to Orkney.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I conclude, for lots and lots and lots of reasons, that Orkney was first populated by initiates of the cosmological tradition who had been educated on Malta and probably born on Crete.
Yep.
And then some of those graduating groups from Orkney, they were educating eight initiates at a time. It looks like those groups were returned back to their original homes with some of their teachers to help guide things. And their teachers looked like they were Dogon priests who were initiated as assistant professors.
Yes.
The first, much later Orkney saga that the Vikings printed or wrote report finding two groups living side by side on Orkney Island. One was a group of short-statured wizards of very strange habits.
Mm-hmm.
And the other was a group of average-sized clerics who always wore white, like the Dogon do, who were so different from the Vikings to be of a different race rather than a different nationality.
Mm-hmm.
So it looks to me as if around in that era, which was, I said, was much, much later, they stumbled across the surviving Dogon priests and their teachers. Their teachers are explained by the Dogon to have originally been non-material. And according to the Dogon, it was one of those classes of orbs, of energetic orbs, that was able to take material form. They made a what's described as the ultimate sacrifice. They made what was a one-way trip to the material domain, knowing full well they wouldn't return, for the express purpose of educating humanity in these cosmological concepts. The Dogon say they had two purposes. One purpose was to help us understand our true relationship to the larger processes of creation.
Mm-hmm.
And the other was to encourage in us a facility for what they call discriminating knowledge. And what that is ultimately the ability to draw a correct inference from a set of facts, because the inferences are hugely more powerful than the facts are.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
It enables you to take a few handful of facts and go far beyond that with your inferences.
Right.
And it's able to extend it through time as well. As languages and symbols change, like It extends through time that way.
That's right. That's right. And again, over time, as humanity gains more knowledge, there's more possibility to make connections. I mean, we're sitting here and I make the connection to the three monopoles in the head of the Dogon house. That's something I should have picked up on a long time ago. We have other symbolism there that looks like it might well connect and might have some meaning for me, but it'll take some study to figure out what it is.
I'm super grateful you did that on our show. Thank you so much.
Well, yeah, that may be a good place to wrap it up. Thank you so much. I enjoyed talking to you, and I'm glad I had managed to sort out many of the images we might want to talk about.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, 2 hours and 43 minutes for a total. We're so grateful for your time. This was I don't know, this was really cool experience for me. And so thank you so much, sir.
Yes,
Well,
thank you.
encourage anyone who has questions to contact me. You can hand out my email address if you want, or they can contact me on Facebook. I'm always happy to answer a question or look into a question. You can see that it's as often a benefit to me as it is to anybody.
Mhm.
So
For sure.
I'm happy to clarify points that I didn't make clear when we were talking. Everything has to come down to a why. If it doesn't, we don't have anything.
Right.
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 Thank you very much. I appreciate you inviting me in the first place and making the effort to sort out a time that worked and all that. And tell
Yeah.
Brittany, thank you very much also.
Yes.
Will do. She's listening. So, yep.
Great.
said-
Thank you. It was great
Yeah.
to meet you.